It seems to me that we've reached a point of limitation where old ideas are reemerging and being examined in the light of present circumstances and a new and broader threat base that might actually force us to see them as more than ideas and actually steps that we have to take. I think that's the difference. Because my professional life has been in policy and politics, I learned early on that all the work you do, to borrow your framing of above ground, below ground, that below ground work is almost always done without ever knowing when that opportunity is going to rise above ground. A very narrow example I learned early on in my advocacy career, it still holds true in a funny, sort of sad way. And that is early on in the 80s even, the differences in the way our national parks were viewed began to emerge. And one was this business of an expectation that a national park was a quiet place. And the Grand Canyon was the first place where that sound difference between what you expect from a national park experience or a wilderness experience was really different in the happening. And a bunch of citizens from around the country came together to create something called a Quiet Canyon proposal. It was a very simple idea, fairly complex in the execution, but it had a frame. This was at a time when Democrats were in power, when passing legislation was happening literally 2 and 3 times a week, sometimes small, sometimes major legislation. But there was a time, not very long ago, when we used to pass laws. And we did. And some of them were written well and some of them weren't, but they were actually, there was legislation. You might not have liked all of it, but it was actually moving. And in that time, the work on the below ground on a Quiet Canyon proposal, which involved lots of details and are not relevant, went into a very fertile legislative arena and still didn't move. There were a lot of other priorities, there were a lot of reasons for it, not really relevant. And then one day, over the Grand Canyon, 2 airplanes crashed head on, and 67 people died that day. And that legislation passed in 72 hours. Now, the Quiet Canyon proposal, in essence, only dealt with was a big idea, and airplane flights over the Grand Canyon were just one piece of it. But that legislation passed because an above-ground event opened the door, and if the work hadn't been done, there would still have never been that legislation passed. Even though that was a different time, the way change happened is very different and is not going to happen that way, I think, going forward. It does remind us that that work cannot bring fruition above ground if we don't do it and we don't stay focused on it. That's one, I think, overall comment. And this work has actually, to my view, somewhat out of ignorance, has never been distilled into the kind of research that regular people can absorb as opposed to those in the academic world, 1. 2, there's never been a plan put in place for when that distillation occurs, that there's agreement over all the elements. And 3rd, there's never been an understanding like we're being forced to understand today. Pardon me, Jared. We've spent a long time believing that the political world drives decisions and is where leadership is. Having spent a lot of my adult life intimately involved in that world, that's just not true. Culture drives change, and today's politics is completely outside the world of culture. And as a result, people in the world of politics are working really hard, digging ditches in the dirt, and the rivers flow in a different way. So before any of the work that we need to do in a 21st century world gets moving in any real way, we've got to understand what a cultural narrative is, what is happening in the world today, how do we enter that conversation, how do we join it and drive it? In many ways, if you cast the world in black and white terms, especially in the context of democracies, there are two balanced values: freedom and equality. And democracies all over the world are either failing in conflict, not just here. And that balance between freedom and equality is off, way off. One side, the side that's currently in power in the United States, has chosen to drive an aggressive freedom narrative that showed up in a lot of the presentations today, but not called out in that context, to the point where the equality narrative is treated as soft, weak, feminine, not secure, and will take mine, whatever mine is. So the immigration issues, the kind of migration issues caused by climate and other violence in the world, is just feeding that narrative every day. And we haven't done the work to try to rebalance that narrative, because none of us want to live in a world without freedom, but none of us want to live in a world where equality is completely stomped on by my individual or even our collective freedoms. So this business of narrative is, unfortunately, our words around narrative have to change, because a narrative can be as insignificant as a slogan and as powerful as a manifesto. For it to become a manifesto, we actually have to dig and work really hard to going into those core values that actually bring us together rather than divide us. And that sounds a little bit Pollyannish to a certain extent in a very complex and divided world. But when the world has become this complex, and when change is driving as fast and as hard as it is, and where division is what we are presented with every day, then actually doing the opposite has leverage like we haven't experienced in a long time. Which means we actually have to decide and then be disciplined. And I actually do think we aren't strong in that arena. And it will require a recognition that these limits have to change our behavior before we can gather people together to collectively change. Anyway, that's my comment.
Thank you. Maggie, for those of you who don't know, ran the Climate Reality Project for, gosh, how many years?
Almost 6.
6. And is still married to who had been our finest senator, Mark Udall.
No argument there.
And knows a great deal about what works in politics, what doesn't work in politics, and is one of the people that I go to for advice on how do we take these conversations and then embed them in the real world of Washington, of the state capitol.